Welcome to 4 Quarter Lives, a podcast exploring the profound impact of longer lives and careers on everything: countries, companies, couples, and careers. I'm Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, and on this week's 4 Quarter Lives, I welcome George Ploubidis, Professor of Population Health and Statistics at University College London's Centre for Longitudinal Studies. He's also the director of 2 of the UK's seminal longitudinal studies that follow large cohorts of people born in a given year throughout their entire lives. The research and data from this leading-edge research is key to understanding what determines health and well-being over time, how to understand real generational differences beyond the labels and the stereotypes, and the different determinants of longevity. He'll also explain his rather terrifying theories around what he calls generational drift. So today I'm delighted to welcome George Ploubidis to 4 Quarter Lives. George, so happy to have you with us.
Good morning, Avivah. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
So you're, among other things, in your role as Professor of Population Health and Statistics at University College London's Centre for Longitudinal Studies. You're also the director of something with a rather strange name that I wanted you to explain to our listeners. You're the director of 1958 NCDS and 1970 BCS. I'm sure this is a key to unlocking the heart of what you do. Tell us what this is all about.
Thank you so much, Avivah, for the question. I know it sounds a bit daunting. What is 1958 NCDS and 1970 BCS? These are 2 of 4 originally national British birth cohorts. And I think this answer kind of leads to more questions. What is a birth cohort and why are they so important in Britain? And I think not only for Britain, but for the planet generally, worldwide. To start with the 1958 and 1970 British birth cohorts, these are 2 large population-based longitudinal surveys to begin with. One of them started in 1958, the other started in 1970. They are birth cohorts because they follow the lives of about 18,000 people each, so 2 different generations, 2 samples of baby boomers born in 1958 and a sample of Generation X born in 1970. Representative samples of Britain, and they follow the lives of these individuals across their life course. They are designed to answer specific questions to begin with about development and so on, but since these samples have been followed up across various life stages, they became multidisciplinary studies, and the evidence and the scientific evidence and the policy impact that was made possible because of this data, various examples ranging from the impact of low birth weight to inequalities in the gender wage gap, let's say, and so on. So they are part of the series of national British birth cohorts. The oldest one also hosted at UCL, the 1946 British birth cohort. Again, same design, cohort members born in 1946 followed through their life course. The Millennium Cohort Study, hosted at the Center for Longitudinal Studies at UCL again, where I work.
It sounds like every decade we take a slice at a large cohort of people born in a given decade.
More or less, yes. I think 1946, 1958, and 1970, every 12 years, we had what was a very nice way actually to having a sample representing a particular generation. There was a gap between 1970 and the Millennium Cohort, various reasons, funding and priorities and everything. But I think since then, we have 2 new cohorts just started now, like last year and so on, again, hosted by the Center for Longitudinal Studies. So I think hopefully this, let's say, 12-year gap between these fantastic and amazing studies that represent various generations across time will continue. But yeah, I think that what you suggested, a 10, 12-year gap was true, minus a gap between Generation X, 1970, and the Millennium Cohort that started in the year 2000. But generally, these are very large population-based representative samples. I make a point of saying that they are representative with very well-known statistical properties. A huge wealth of information. They're not just surveys. They're more than that. They're, for example...
Tell me a little bit. How do you talk to these people? How often? How many times a year?
So data collection is very, of course, how we do data collection. Usually, if you look at how often data were collected across the surveys, there are differences across the survey, but let's say We do collect data on average once every 5 years. Of course, earlier on in life, when development is important and big changes do happen, for example, in the Millennium Cohort, the very first sweeps were about 9 months, 3 years, 5 years, and so on. So it's not once every 5 years an average across the life. Of course, depending on the life stage, there is more than that. But these are the main surveys we do when we contact either the parents or then the cohort members when they grow older themselves and so on. Let's say it takes the form of an interview, which usually it's about 70 to 80 minutes with all sorts of questions about all aspects of life. But this is not the only source of data we have. This is one source of data. There are other sources of data. For example, these cohorts are linked with electronic health records, a very important source of health data, for example. They're also linked with education administrative databases. So we have knowledge about the school, the type of school, and so on that the cohort members went to and so on, and their achievements and everything. Also, we have geographical data, area level information as well. So there is a wealth of data across people's lives. And I will stress again that these are very multidisciplinary studies. So it's not about a single discipline or a very specific focus. They're very broad churches, if I may say.
You're the head of two, those born in 58 and 70.
Yes, correct.
Give me one takeaway. What's been your biggest, surprise in the difference between these two groups of people that you've been following yourself?
Well, generational differences or similarities. When we think about generations, I think generally speaking, social change, which is important. We live in organized societies, right? And social change is important and can influence health, or health can influence social change, or can influence various things. But change usually happens within, but also between generations. But also there are similarities between generations, not only differences. But one of the most surprising things, to me at least, right, and maybe it's because I'm professor of population health and statistics, but to me at least was that despite, for example, in the UK, in Britain, where we know that post-war living standards improved generally, no matter which indicator you look at it, generally on average,
Yep.
living standards improved. One surprising finding is that people born in 1970s, Generation X, compared to baby boomers, for example, have worse health. That's one surprising finding. It's not very intuitive as a finding. Also considering not only that standards of living improved on average again, but also that life expectancy, with some exceptions, generally continue to improve in post-war Britain and so on. That's one of the surprising findings, to give you an example.
So we're living longer, and we would expect that because of just better health and environmental outcomes post-war that we would get healthier, but you're saying that actually the contrary is true. We're getting less healthy. We'll come back to this point. Let me first ask a little bit about you, because this is a whole broad-based, fascinating area of research. I'm curious how you got into it. You were born in Greece. You now live and work in London at UCL. Give us a little overview just of how you got here and what's been your path.
How I got here. So I think, yes, I was born in Athens, Greece, my hometown, and still, I'm a Londoner. I love London, of course, but Athens is always home. So both two homes, Athens and London. I was born in 1975 in Athens. I think I was very lucky. I was part of, I think Generation X in Greece was very lucky in the sense that, Greece, the post-war history of Greece, a bit tumultuous and so on. But I think post-1974, where democracy was established in Greece, I think things got better. I was born in 1975. In the 1980s in Greece, middle class was kind of created. There wasn't a middle class before. There was a lot of poverty in Greece, even in post-war Greece. I was very lucky. I was brought up by two very loving and highly educated parents, but I'm stressing the point, I was very loving, caring, and so on. So I was very lucky. Both highly educated, and generally knowledge and learning was a big thing in the household. There's a tradition in my family of academics, not only academics, medical doctors, economists, and so on, but there are some academics as well in Greece. To cut a long story short, I got very, very lucky, and when I finished my PhD, I got a job offering for a postdoctoral research at the University of Cambridge. And, nobody says no to Cambridge. Well, I didn't. I wouldn't say no to Cambridge, of course. So I was very lucky because I went there, and this is how I got really the first glimpse of the British birth cohorts, because this post, the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Cambridge, was really to work on mental health across the life course with something that was called the 1946 British birth cohort. I had no idea what this was, obviously, until I got there. And then I was so amazed. I meant, really? Do you have data across the lives of people? Imagine my surprise when I found out soon after, a couple of months in, or within the first month, that it's not the only birth cohort in Britain. There are more than that. So this was my first...
I had no idea there were so many. I mean, I know the Harvard centenarian study that everybody refers to from 1929. I didn't realize that there was a whole series of them here in the UK.
Yes, the Harvard study is a great study. Of course, absolutely. The British birth cohorts, aside of the longevity, they are also vitally important is that the way they were sampled and the fact that they're representative of a known population.
Not like the Harvard class, which was just a bunch of...
Yes, but I think it's important because other studies are very important as well. But so that was my first kind of realize, oh my God, British birth cohorts. And, and then things happened. I will not bore you with my life story. And 20 years later on, I have the privilege and the honor to be director of two of those fantastic studies. And, I think being director of these long-running studies is really standing on the shoulder of giants, really. There were so many great scientists before me that made sure that these studies continue, get funded and so on, or great scientists, as I speak, other scientists in the Center for Longitudinal Studies that make sure that with our new cohort studies, starting now and 50 years from now, somebody else, hopefully, will be doing a podcast and saying, look, these are great studies and so on. I was hugely impressed by this data. I love cohorts. I think it's a fantastic design to understand, the human condition generally. And since then, since 2004, when I kind of found out that there is such a thing that is called the British birth cohort, longitudinal data in general, all my work, all my scientific interests, and also my methodological work, which within my scientific interest has been focusing on longitudinal data and so on.
So I want to crack into what you've learned. It is, I agree, an extraordinary slice of human experience that you are recording here. You've been looking at these long-term trends in both the US and the UK, I think. And you say that they're characterized by something called generational drift. This is not a nice term, George. It's a little worrying. Can you explain what it is and how it's showing up?
Yes, I think to begin with, the work that we have been doing was focused on the British cohorts, but then, of course, that was expanded with trends in the US and elsewhere. Coming back a little bit to how we can observe these such big long-term trends, these cohorts travel through time, as individuals, the cohort members, they grow up, various life stages and so on. But because we have all these different generations, they travel through different historical contexts. So we can observe various macrosocial trends and how they impact on various generational differences, let's say. And of course, one thing to recall is that these studies, the wealth of information they include is social, economic, health, environmental, quite everything really. And that allows us to, simply, I think it's a very simple idea to compare generations and try to understand the similarities and differences, really. One persistent finding that replicates itself, first of all, in the cohorts, in the national birth cohorts, but other longitudinal surveys as well, is that younger generations at the same age, despite expected to live longer, still expected to live longer, according to projections and the post-pandemic projections. We also had a pandemic very recently. Despite expect to live longer, at the same age, they have worse health outcomes. And that includes physical health and things like, let's say, diabetes or, of course, obesity. The obesity epidemic is part of it, but also includes mental health. Now, the generational health drift is one way to describe this in order, I guess, I think it's important. It's one of those trends that, generally speaking, they are a little bit known, let's say, in demography circles or gerontology, maybe. I don't think they receive the attention they should. Let's say, the well-known stagnation in life expectancy in the UK from 2020, before the pandemic, so 10 years before the pandemic, life expectancy in the UK stopped increasing, stagnated. That also had some attention, but not as much attention as, let's say, the economy has. When, for a quarter, we have like a small GDP goes...
Our life expectancy has stopped growing in only 2 countries on the planet hasn't really gotten the attention that it really should,
Fully agree. But on top of that, I think also the generational health drift, which I agree is a term that I think we need to have a term that describes a phenomenon.
Term. It's just a very scary one, right? The idea of generational drift, We're trying to make humans improve and progress over time. And if we're actually witnessing kids and generations getting increasingly not well, both mentally and physically, that's an issue of rising debate, as you have seen.
Fully agree. I think it's great for this to get attention and being debated. I think that's great. I think the empirical evidence, at least from Britain and the US, in some other high-income countries as well, we need to do more science in middle and low-income countries to see whether actually this is also a phenomenon there, or it's something that will happen in 10 or 20 years because there is a lag, or it would not happen at all. We need proper science to actually do this. I think it's an important trend. It is a worrying trend, I agree. But I think we need proper science. First of all, to understand the antecedents, the drivers of the trend, because I don't think we do understand the drivers yet. The drivers may be different across countries. It doesn't mean that because we observe a similar trend in the US and the UK, the drivers are the same. There may be some similar drivers, some different drivers. We need to do better science on this. And also to understand the consequences of this, which I think is very important, because I think if the post-pandemic projections of life expectancy generally in most countries that, yes, life expectancy will bounce back, and we have seen it bounce back in most places, and will increase. But if you couple this increase in life expectancy with the generational health drift, that means more years spent in poor health, which of course is not a great scenario for individuals, but also is not a great scenario for the labor market, for the healthcare, for societies in general, and so on. We want to go the opposite direction. We want to compress the years of poor health, and we also want to make sure that even the years of not good health are years of great quality of life, years of productivity, and years that people can enjoy as well despite this. So yes, it's a worrying trend.
Before I move to what we need to do to shift the drift and sort of address that, why comes to mind? Why is this trend? How are you explaining it? I assume that there's a multiplicity of factors and that they differ across countries. But can you give us some idea of what you think the cause is?
Well, I think it's the most important, conflict of interest here. I do this kind of research, right? Or I want to do this kind of research. I think it's a very, very, very important questions with very important scientific questions with very important policy implications as well, because we want to make people's lives better at the end of the day. That's what we really want to do. Yep. It's not an academic debate, just an academic debate. It's very important. I love academic debates. I do them all the time. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is improving people's lives. I think reasons behind this, as you suggested, Avivah, I think I fully agree. When we observe such a trend in the population or various different populations across the globe, I don't think usually it's not these very dominant trends, let's say. It don't happen just because of a single factor.
Yeah.
Coming back to the British birth cohorts. The British birth cohorts, because of their design, they have offered us already some unique insights into this generational health drift. For example, we know that when it comes to mental health, when you mentioned mental health, let's say early life mental health, this generational drift or the worsening of mental health, of early life mental health, started happening with Gen Z. It wasn't observed before. So, for example, when we compare the mental health at age, in adolescence, between Generation X and baby boomers, it was more or less the same. We weren't observing that Generation X in adolescence had worse mental health. That happened with Gen Z. So that gives us some idea of, okay, what are the factors that may have changed. But on the contrary, when it comes to the obesity epidemic, we could observe difference between Generation X and baby boomers even earlier on, even in adolescence. To give you another example, when we look at...
we're adding to the drift, we're adding a series of problems as we go. So first, obesity hit, and now you're saying Gen Z is adding this layer of mental health challenges.
Yes, but to add to this, I think the mental health challenge is that mental health challenge, let's say in adolescence or early life. But if you look at midlife mental health, Generation X have, at least in Britain, have worse mental health compared to baby boomers in midlife. So I think we need to, first of all, understand the phenomenon really well. First of all, we need to describe the phenomenon, understand it really well, across the various generations, across different contexts, and so on. I think we do have strong empirical evidence as we speak that, yes, there is such a thing, at least for some health outcomes, important population health outcomes, this is happening. And that gives us some ideas to start speculating, but we need proper science to actually answer the question. Now, in terms of speculation, of course, the obesity epidemic is a large part of it. But then why the obesity epidemic happened, I think there is a debate about this, but I think plausibly argue, yes, change in dietary habits and so on, which of course is not about individuals making wrong choices. It's about also structural factors. It's about what kind of food is available, what kind of food is advertised, and the price of healthy food versus non-healthy food and so on. I think the obesity epidemic, understanding the obesity epidemic as one of the drivers and the drivers of the obesity epidemic as a big part of this is quite important. But since it's not just about physical health, but of course it's also about mental health and about changes that happen in the population much after the onset of the obesity epidemic, I think other factors do matter. So I think different factors are at play when we look at adolescent mental health compared to midlife mental health and so on, or diabetes or other factors and so on. The point I'm trying to make here is that I don't think a single explanation, one size fits all. And I think we need proper science to actually answer the question of why.
You're kind of answering the current debate on Gen Z and mental health, which a number of American academics are pointing very loudly to social media and its overuse. And I think what you're saying is it's hard to find a single cause.
Yes, I think social media, I'm not suggesting social media or, use of device and so on. Of course, very, very important, profound social change, and it happened. And so, but I'm not suggesting that maybe they have nothing to do with this or they're not part of the bigger picture. But I think looking at the empirical evidence, from the British birth cohorts and British longitudinal surveys, which are the best studies on the planet, to actually understand this on a population level. If you look at this evidence and look at the work of colleagues that are experts on this, you will find out that if there is an impact on social media on explaining the mental health difference or mental health, that's small or a part of it.
Yeah.
Also, it may be that in different contexts, different countries, the other factors, social media may be more important in one context, less in another, or both. But my view on this is that it's plausible that it is one of the many factors that drive this. But I would argue that there are other factors at play that we need to look at quite a lot. There is some, for example, we need to look at between generation inequality and within generations inequality. And also we need to be very focused on the outcome of interest when we're explaining difference between generations, as I mentioned before. For example, when we talk about adolescent mental health, aside of inequality within generations, and of course the role of social media, which again may be socially patterned as well, by the way, we may need to think about maybe differences in parenting, maybe differences in how adolescents of various generations spend their time and so on. But again, as we speak, these are at the level of speculation. There is maybe some evidence. We need more and proper science to actually understand this very important trend in order to improve policy. I don't think singling out as a factor and looking at part of the evidence helps.
Okay. So we will wait to see a little bit what emerges, but you are flagging that the science does prove that there's a real mental health challenge for this generation.
I think it's well accepted. And if you look at the empirical evidence from population-based samples with a lot of methodological work underlying the validity of these comparisons across generations, a lot of methodological work from various groups and from various data sets, I think it's well accepted that along the obesity epidemic and some other physical health conditions, mental health in more recently born cohorts is worse compared to previous cohorts. I think that's a scientific consensus as we speak.
We can see and touch that, many of us, with our own children. So yes, that's not one we're likely to debate. So let's turn a little bit to the determinants of healthy aging. Can you describe a little bit, what are some of the key differences that you are observing, for example, between men and women, between these cohorts, and what's their impact?
Well, I think one important aspect in terms of theory, but in terms of data, when we happen to have this data, is I think when we think of aging, I think a life course perspective is very, very important. I think in order to understand the present generally, we have to look into in the past.
Explain a little bit what a life course perspective is for.
The life course perspective, it's a combination of theories. It's coming from sociology, psychology, epidemiology, and so on. Various different disciplines have very similar ideas across time, and that happens in science. I mean, that's great. That's why science is great. A lot of people have not identical, but similar ideas and so on. I think it encompasses this view that at different stages in life, all stages in life matter, whatever outcomes you observe later on in life. Of course, early life is vastly important, and that is the scientific consensus, from various disciplines and so on. It began as a theoretical perspective, but the actual empirical evidence on why early life matters and the actual empirical evidence quantifying this very important impact, and I'm using causal language here on purpose, impact of early life on whatever happens in adulthood and later on, that comes from the British birth cohorts. Because we happen to have the data, and data allows for science. Without data, we cannot do science, really.
This is like the exposome. Everything that you're exposed to at any part of your life impacts the rest of the life ahead of you.
Put it this way, I think what data allows is to go a bit beyond the everything bit of this sentence and understand the factors that matter, understand the factors that matter maybe within generations and across generations. To give you some examples of the important findings, let's say, from these life course studies, when it comes to early life, I think factors that we know do matter and influence what happens later on in terms of social, economic, and health outcomes. Well, family background and the socioeconomic background of the family is vastly important. It is important. And it has a profound influence on health, economic, social outcomes across the life.
And fairness is baked in right from birth, yes.
Absolutely. Well, and I think the most robust empirical evidence of how this actually unfolds it can be found in the British birth cohorts. And it's something that, has been shown not now, because the British birth cohorts have been around since 1946, but since then there was a lot of work on how inequality in early life matters.
Yeah.
And this is one of the major findings of these cohorts. And, they, in a sense, they confirmed what was a theoretical perspective from various disciplines. This is where the actual hard empirical evidence came from. Socioeconomic position in early life matters quite a lot. And socioeconomic position, of course, influences various other things early on and later on. Other aspects of early life that do matter quite a lot. Early life mental health is another finding, robust finding from the British birth cohorts. We know early life mental health, which of course is in itself socially patterned, has a strong impact on social, economic, and health outcomes across the life course in adulthood and beyond. Adverse childhood experiences, important as well. And we know that, of course, these are also socially patterned. So I think these are kind of some examples of findings that showcase the life course perspective and how early life does matter.
Yeah.
But it's not just about early life. There are other life stages that are important, especially when we think about healthy longevity and the fact that we will be living longer and how to make sure that we do this in the best possible way.
Okay, so some of the outcomes, are they going to be things like we actually have to invest much more in 0 to 3? Are these absolutely critical years? I mean, that's been seen and done in the past and then undone, and we swing like a pendulum back and forth between some of these ideas.
I think it's vastly important, of course, to invest, 0 to 3, 0 to 5, it's very important to invest in early years and focus on inequality and eliminating, if possible, inequalities. That are, of course, difficult to eliminate, but reduce and give. At the end of the day, it's about giving every child equal opportunities, really. Equal opportunities to have a fair shot in life later on. Inequalities in early life matter, but that's of vital importance, absolutely. We also know that midlife matters as well. When we think of, what happens when we are 70, 80, or 90, what influences our health, social, economic outcomes later on? Midlife also matters. And I think it's also very important to stress that, yes, early life matters, but it's not a deterministic effect. We have a lot of evidence from the cohorts that despite adversity, socioeconomic adversity early on, resilience or reversibility, they're not identical concepts, but they are related. The resilience can occur. So, for example, we have cohort members that, despite their family disadvantaged economic background, their social, health, and economic outcomes were not bad, let's say, and were really good and so on, and they managed really good social, health, and economic outcomes. And there are various factors that can help with that. One, for example, one great finding from the British birth cohort is reading. When parents read to their children, reading for pleasure and so on, as it is called. That's one way that parents can help children overcome disadvantage and so on. Other factors and so on. So I would like to stress that it's not that, early years did happen and that there's nothing to be done. Absolutely not. We can intervene early on or later on or in midlife and so on. Because
Tell me what the interventions at midlife are that matter.
Well, midlife, the conflict of interest, and midlife as we speak,
Yes, exactly.
conflict of interest there. Well, I think first of all, we need to understand midlife. It wasn't getting, traditionally speaking, either the focus was on early life or later life. Midlife was a bit neglected up until recently, I think. A couple of things about midlife. First of all, midlife is a period of peak distress, peak psychological distress. Mental health is not really great in midlife. Generally speaking, if you look at the British cohorts who have data across the life course on psychological distress, let's say symptoms of depression and anxiety, midlife is a period of high distress. Various reasons of that.
Which isn't very well known, is it? Beyond the midlife crisis.
Again, I think midlife crisis and so on, it's part of it, I guess. But I think, again, the empirical evidence, you need to have data across the life course and actually properly show this without... And so, but this, I agree, it is well known, and I think that was confirmed from the data and the science, of course, that was done because of this data in the British cohort. So I think intervening in midlife mental health is important, could be important as an intervention, because I think we know mental health, aside of being a risk factor for mental health in the future itself, we know that it's an important driver of morbidity and mortality generally. And also we know mental health may have a strong impact on economic activity and so on. So I think when we think about midlife, one thing to consider is that, yes, indeed, there's a lot of science that shows that it is a peak psychological distress type of period. Thinking about midlife and thinking about inequalities, for example, between men and women and so on, we need to think about employment. And when you think about employment, for example, we know from the British birth cohorts that full-time employment is much less in women compared to men. And that is because, for various factors, including inequalities when it comes to caring responsibilities and so on. There is a big gender wage gap, which again, a lot of evidence again from the cohorts and elsewhere. And I think, again, this is something that starts in early adulthood, but manifests strongly in midlife. Again, this is something that, of course, we need to intervene and eliminate this inequality as well. But again, when it comes to midlife, because it has been neglected a little bit, we need to understand midlife a bit more. And yes, of course, there are some knowledge about mental health and specific inequalities between men and women, employment and income and so on that are quite important, not just in midlife, beyond that, but intervening in midlife will make future life stages much better, at least. But I think we need to understand midlife a bit more. We need more science, actually, to understand midlife and why. For example, yes, we have some ideas why it's a peak psychological distress period, but we need to understand this more and also understand what kind of interventions would work more. So my response to this is, yes, reducing inequality, especially between men and women, absolutely, of course. And then understand what drives the peak in midlife, peak in psychological distress, and intervening there are good places to start. We need more science on midlife. Okay. We don't understand it as well as we should, I think.
No, absolutely. It's not been anywhere near as much studied as childhood or adolescence. So yes, we're all waiting for that, George. Send it along. So let me just zoom out a little bit and ask, how does the new shape of global population pyramids change the whole landscape of what you're doing and impact your work?
Well, I would say that the direction of causality there is because of the change in population pyramid. I do the work that I do, I guess, in the sense that, again, a little bit back on my life journey and so on. When I left Cambridge, I was very lucky and I was appointed as a lecturer at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which, among other things, very well-known school for epidemiology, but also for demography. And this was my kind of introduction to the fantastic, wonderful world of demography, and I identify as a demographer ever since, really. This phenomenon, the population pyramid and population aging was always something that, of course, as a citizen, I knew and so on. But the scientific study of populations, which is vastly important and should underpin all our decisions when it comes to policy, understanding population change and population structures. I think this is the cause of the work that I do, really. I think population aging, of course, is one of the dominant trends of the 21st century. It has happened already and it will happen. It will not go away. Yeah. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a population shift, a population change that we need to embrace and do the best with it. It's one of the dominant trends, along, of course, with climate change and so on, which is also a dominant trend. Those two things might have some overlap, some interrelations. Climate change influences what happens to population pyramids, and, well, more or less what we do about climate change can be also influenced by the population pyramids and change and so on. I think population aging is a dominant trend of the 21st century. It has a lot of attention, but I think it needs more attention and more understanding about the kind of policies we need to enact in order for us to ensure healthy longevity in the 21st century and beyond, really. For example, when it comes to climate change, don't get me wrong, climate change is vastly important and it deserves even more attention and even more policy, our focus and so on. But equally speaking, population aging is a very important population trend, dominant trend, which will change people's lives and will also influence how, I guess, we organize ourselves as societies and how we go about things and so on. So I think it deserves more attention. Yeah. And to be quite honest, I think the work that I do is a little bit more knowledge, I hope, towards this. But the direction of causality, I think, is population change did happen. Some very wise people that I was very privileged and honored to work with at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine taught me a lot of things and understood a lot of things, hopefully, about it. And, hence, I'm working on this area.
On the work that you're doing, 90% of the data on generational cohorts, you say, is now freely available. Can you just tell us where our listeners can access them? And we'll put all the links in the show notes.
Of course, and thank you so much, Avivah, for asking this question, because I totally forgot to mention this is the most important thing. That the data are free.
Is this data you're sitting on?
Yes. No, absolutely. Not sitting on the data are freely available to scientists worldwide. It's not George's data. Absolutely not. So the data are hosted within the Center for Longitudinal Studies. And I say 90% because these are the survey data.
Yep.
All the survey data are available via a place called the UK Data Service. We will provide the links. People can actually go to the website of the UK Data Service or the Center for Longitudinal Studies website. There is a very dedicated page on data access. And then, every scientist worldwide with an internet connection can download the data, really, and use the data. And please do so. These data are amazing. And, scientists from Britain and overseas and worldwide have been using them. But we need more and more. And I think the more scientists worldwide that use the data, the more knowledge we will have and the more impact we will have in, improving people's lives. The 10% of the data, more or less, I'm just giving an estimate, that are not available to download within 10 or 15 minutes after you log into the UK Data Service. These data are a bit more sensitive data. For example, electronic health records. These studies are also fully genotyped. So this is a different process. On the Center for Longitudinal Studies website, there's a data access. It's a very simple process. You apply, there's a data access committee, and after a month or two, researchers around the world or from Britain can get access to this data as well. But the vast majority of the data and the majority of the data that can allow to answer the vast majority of questions for this data are available without any other type of committee or process and so on via the UK Data Service.
And we will put all the links to that because we have a lot to do to reverse the generational drift you're talking about if we want to see a healthy 2 billion older people move past 60 over the coming decades. So, George, my podcast is called 4 Quarter Lives, and my last question is always the same. I ask each guest to metaphorize each of their own 4 quarters of a 100-year life. What would each of your quarters be called or represent?
I've been thinking about it, Avivah, and it's a very important question. I always think about my life as a journey into knowledge, right? And learning about myself and learning about the world around me. And I've been thinking, being slightly anxious, okay, oh my God, what am I going to say to Avivah? What is the best metaphor? And to be honest, I will go back to the most honest answer, what came to my head first, because I think that's the most honest answer and not like me overthinking about and so on. I couldn't hard thresholds between quarters of my life, if I may. I think it's a continuous journey. It's like a book, really. I don't know. I think of my life as a book. And, you read the first chapters and you're very excited about this new book and so on. It's all about knowledge and understanding. And then, of course, the more you read the book, the more you know. But then you can also go back to the first chapters, right? And really get to think, oh, you know what? I read this first chapter, but now that I've read half the book, let's say, me in midlife, that's half the book probably. My understanding back then maybe wasn't as complete as I thought and so on. So to me, it's about a journey. I think the more you read the book, the more you get towards the end, whenever that end is, the more you understand life itself, the book. But to me, it's also not only about individuals, it's about we live in organized societies. And of course, we're individuals, and of course, that's very important. I'd like to, it's a constant, not battle, but a journey of understanding myself, but also understand the world around me. But I think what is vitally important, that links also with the work that I do, is that there is the idea of the common good. And I think it's a journey. To me, my life is always, I see my life as a journey akin to a book. So I'm getting more knowledge, understanding myself and the world better. But the actual goal is to make people's lives better. Yes, that includes my life, right? We're all individuals, obviously, but it's also improving people's life with always the idea of the common good being an important idea. And going back to the metaphor about quarters, let's say in the first quarter of my life, I had this idea about the gay society and so on being important and so on. But I think in the second quarter of my life that I have a better understanding of the vital importance of the common good and also how it can profoundly influence people's lives, even in situations or places where we think, no, it doesn't. It's all about individuals. It's not about whatever. So I would say a book, chapters of a book.
I am looking forward to the second half of your book where you will continue to contribute to the common good. George Ploubidis, we need you badly. Thank you for all the work you do, and I look forward to keeping updated on all the fascinating facets and discoveries that these various cohort studies are going to yield for us and for everyone.
Thank you so much, Avivah, for inviting me. That has been fantastic, and I would like to finish by saying that despite all this we discussed, right, generational health drift and so on and everything, I'm very optimistic about the future. We can change things. It's within our hands, and I think proper science can help us to inform policy and make sure that we can achieve healthy longevity in the 21st century and beyond.
Thank you for that optimistic finish. I appreciate it. I'm sure our listeners will too. And we're going to plunge into some of your data going forward. Thanks again, George. Fantastic. For more thinking about the impact of our 4-quarter lives, you can read my column at Forbes and subscribe to my Elderberries newsletter on Substack. Let's design lives that aren't just longer, but better.